Hello and welcome to the fourth episode of the Reti Nimzo Larsen Speedrun series. In this episode, we are playing against players in the rating range of 900 to 1000. We're playing three different games, taking a look at how to play against these opponents, how we're able to get a space advantage in a number of these games, taking advantage of opponents' mistakes. There's one particular game where our opponent kind of walks into a tactic that we're able to punish them with, and we get a large advantage after that. And then a couple of the other games, we're also being able to gain a lot of space, control the center of the board well, take advantage of the opportunity our opponents give us when we are able to put multiple pawns around the center of the board. And that's going to be the focus of the three games we have in this rating range. So, without further ado, let's jump right into the games. So, we're starting off with the knight f3. Our opponent goes for knight to c6 here, which is a move that we have to be a bit careful about autopiloting against, I would say. So, as I think I've mentioned in some of the previous episodes, whenever we're playing this particular opening repertoire, and if our opponent makes a move that hints at the possibility of them playing the move pawn to e5, we are going to play in a way that prevents the opponent from making that move. So, for example, if we autopiloted here with the move b3, black would be able to play the move pawn to e5, and after bishop to b2, they could support the pawn, and then they're kind of able to shut down our bishop's diagonal without us being able to have this wide open line that we would normally like to have. So, since our opponent is potentially looking to play the move e5 on move number 2 of the game, we are going to go with the move d4. And depending on how black plays here, especially if they do play the move d5, which is what they went for in the game, it might kind of feel like it might feel a bit like we are just turning this into a d4 opening. You might think, well, isn't this supposed to be the Reti Nimzo Larsen? Why are we playing d4 and making this a d4 opening? Um, the main point here, or the main drawback, I would say, to black's position is the placement of this knight that's on the c6 square. In most d4, d5 types of openings, the opponent should not be putting their knight on the c6 square for kind of two main reasons. Number one, the knight on c6 makes it more difficult for black to make a move like pawn to c6 to support the center. And number two, the knight is also in the way of black potentially using their c-pawn to attack our center. So the knight on c6 is a bit misplaced, and we're going to try to play around that as the game goes on. So we are going to continue here with the move pawn to c4. We're kind of playing it now like a queen's gambit, with our opponent having played this kind of not fantastic knight to c6 idea. So here black makes, I think, an instructive mistake. They make the move knight to f6. They are defending their pawn on d5 with two different pieces. But usually when you're playing any kind of queen's gambit type of opening, where you're using your c pawn to attack the opponent's d pawn that's in the center, most of the time it's best for the opponent to reinforce their d5 pawn with another pawn of their own. So they couldn't make the move pawn to c6, as we already talked about, because the knight's in the way. But a better option for black might have been a move like pawn to e6, or it might have been better for them to take the pawn on c4. Those are usually kind of the main options that black will work with here in this type of situation. Another option might be a move like pawn to e5, trying to kind of counterattack the center, but this particular opponent goes for knight to f6. And if the opponent cannot recapture with the pawn on d5, it is usually very good for us to go ahead and make the capture ourselves. They're going to have to recapture with the piece. In this case, they chose the queen rather than the knight. And once they recapture with the piece, we are going to be able to attack this piece that's in the center of the board. So here we're going to go knight to c3, attacking the queen. The queen is going to have to move away somewhere. In this case, it goes back to the d6 square. And what we're going to be able to do now is I'm leaning towards the move pawn to e4, simply pushing in the center, potentially looking to push the pawn all the way up to the e5 square, which will fork the queen and the knight. And we're simply going to be able to get a pretty large space advantage, and black is not going to have an easy time dealing with that. So let's grab that space. Let's threaten the fork. Black has to watch out for this idea. In this particular case, he does not respond to our idea, and it looks like we can simply push the pawn all the way up to e5, forking the queen and the knight. Wherever the queen moves, we'll take the knight, and I think we're going to be in good shape here. I suppose black could play queen to e6 to pin our pawn, but I think that we can play maybe d5 ends up working out in that situation, but I think this move is still going to be good. We'll cross that bridge if black plays queen e6 once we get there. But if they don't play queen e6, I think we're going to be taking the knight on f6 pretty quickly and coming out ahead of piece pretty soon. Okay, so they decided to take our knight on f3 first. This is probably one of their better tricks they could have up their sleeve, so to speak. So we have to be a little bit careful with how we recapture this bishop. First of all, we don't want to take the queen because they will take our queen. And once we recapture the bishop on d1, we won't have come out of this ahead of piece because black took a knight of ours and our queen. We got their queen and their bishop, and we wouldn't actually be ahead. So what we want to do is recapture the bishop on f3. I think we want to recapture with the pawn is what I'm leaning towards. Though it might work to take with the queen as well, but I'm kind of leaning towards taking with the pawn so that we are going to be able to kind of just maintain the fork. I guess you could take with the queen, and if black takes in the center trying to attack our queen, we can just take their knight, or sorry, take their queen. They take us, we take back. I think we're going to end up ahead of piece there as well. So I'm not entirely sure if it really makes a huge difference as to which piece we recapture with. I think we're going to be coming out ahead material here regardless. I do suppose, though, now that I'm looking at it a bit more, whichever way we recapture, black could still make this queen to e6 move, which is a little bit annoying. So I think with that being the case, I think I am going to take with the queen on f3. If they play knight takes d4 to counterattack my queen, I think we'll just take their queen and end up winning the knight in that kind of situation. So I think we're going to go for this here. If the queen moves away, we'll take the knight. If they pin the pawn, probably there I'll just play the move bishop to e3 and break the pin, and I think we're going to be still in good shape in that situation. Okay, so they played this move, knight takes d4. I don't think that this works out well, mainly because I am able to take their queen. They can get mine, but I'm going to be capturing the knight and coming out ahead of piece with all of this. So I take their queen. They'll take mine, most likely. I will recapture. They'll take the pawn on d6. And so I have captured a knight. I am ahead one minor piece in this position, but I am down 2 pawns. So it's not the end of the world for black necessarily. It is actually still going to take some work for me to convert this position into a win ultimately, but that's what we're going to work towards doing here. So first of all, what I'm going to begin with is I'm actually going to play the move rook to g1 to start with. I like putting the rook on this half-open file, and I kind of make it so that the bishop is a little bit tied down to this g-pawn. So black decides to castle, which is reasonable. Let's go ahead and I think I'll play the move. Let's just develop the bishop to e3. I don't really want to make the pin because then we would be blocking off our rook from attacking the g-pawn. I kind of want to wait for black to do something about this g-pawn that they're kind of tied down to protecting. Okay, they push the pawn up to d5. Very reasonable move. They are threatening to push further and make a fork. I'm going to go ahead and castle here. I do put a little bit more pressure on the pawn, but more importantly, I keep the d4 square under control so that they can't advance and fork me. So they play the move c6 to reinforce the d5 pawn, but I do think that this ends up being a mistake because now I do have the option of capturing this pawn on a7. Usually it's a bit risky to use a bishop or a knight to grab these edge pawns. A lot of the times the problem would be that the opponent would push the b pawn and trap the bishop and kind of lock it in place. That would have been an issue a moment ago. If I had taken the pawn right away, they might have pushed the pawn to b6. But now that they've pushed the pawn up to c6, when I do capture this pawn, they are not able to make the move pawn to b6 because I would be taking the pawn in that case. And so next move, I'm probably going to just retreat the bishop back to safety. May also throw in a check with the other bishop at some point and see how things go there. So black decides to develop their bishop. The downside to this for them is they are giving up the pawn on g7. I'm going to go ahead and grab that pawn. I did talk earlier about how I was playing that move rook g1 in the first place so that black would have a little bit of trouble moving the bishop off of f8 because they would need to keep that pawn protected. So now my rook is very active. I might take the pawn on f7. Might throw in a check on h3, attacking the king. Let's see, what does the move order matter here that much? I could check first. If the king moves up, I take on f7 with check. The knight blocks. I'm not sure if we have a fantastic follow-up, but we are still ahead of piece and in good shape. I think that being said, let's take the pawn first and see if black kind of makes a mistake. So not only am I threatening the knight, but I'm also threatening the move bishop to h3, which is pretty close to being checkmate, um, depending on how black reacts to that. So they made this move rook to f8. I'm going to throw in the check on h3, and I think here black is just going to be losing material. Because if they block with the knight, which is pretty much the only way that they can deal with the check in a good way, then the problem for black here is that the knight on d7 and the rook on f8 are both being protected by the exact same piece. If I take the knight on d7 and then the rook on f8, I'll be able to win material in this position. I don't want to take the rook on f8 first because once the rook recaptures on f8, I don't have that second attacker on the knight. So we're going to take the knight with check first. If the rook takes, then we take the rook on f8, which is now unprotected. And now we are ahead an entire rook and a knight with a very, very large advantage. Okay, let's bring our bishop back to e3, I think. Just to get that back to safety, I don't want to have to worry about the move b6. Now that I'm looking at it, actually, some people in the comments might point this out. I did have the move bishop to b8 check, skewering the king to the bishop. That would have actually been clearly better. We would have checked and taken the bishop on h2. But, okay, it is what it is. Lots of moves are good here. I'm going to just play it simple. Let's go bishop f4 check, attacking the king as well as the bishop. If they had taken my bishop, I was going to recapture, and then I was just trying to trade pieces. Here we can just capture the bishop for free. And now we're ahead of rook and two minor pieces. I do only have about a minute on the clock, so I'm going to have to speed up a little bit here. Probably I will get the rook on the open file. It's a position where lots of moves are good. They push the pawn. Let's go for the move pawn to b4. Probably just going to push these pawns up the board and see if we can try to checkmate black. So let's keep pushing. a5 is the idea now. Give this check. The king goes to the a6 square, and now the king has no escape squares in this position. The only safe spots for the king are a6 and a8, or sorry, a6 and a7, and we can use the rook to check on a8, which does deliver a checkmate in this position here. So, very interesting game. Let's go back through it and analyze it. So, knight f3, knight to c6. As mentioned in the game, when the opponent is hinting at the potential idea of pushing the pawn all the way up to the e5 square, we are generally going to respond to this with the move d4, preventing that from happening. And we essentially get into a queen's gambit type of position, which you could have technically gotten this exact same position after d4, d5, c4, knight c6, knight f3. This is what's known as the Chigorin defense. And it ends up that the way that black responded to the c4 move with the move knight to f6 is not a very good option for black to go for. I think the main move for black here, I think it might be bishop to g4. I know in the chessable course, there's multiple options for our opponent that are covered in this position. I think the main move might be bishop to g4, or taking the pawn on c4. I think those might be the two kind of main options. But this opponent goes for the move knight f6. And as mentioned during the game, once again, when you can trade off your c pawn, which is kind of a non-central pawn, for the opponent's central d5 pawn, without them being able to recapture with another pawn, the big problem they run into here is that they now have only one central pawn of their own, and we have two central pawns. And we were able to put this to good use pretty quickly here. We hit the queen, got a big space advantage in the center, made the fork, eventually came out of this ahead material. It might have been the case that queen to e6 was a better move for the opponent to try to play. That way they don't lose a piece because they are pinning the pawn. If they had done this, I think I was going to play the move bishop to e3. Now we're back to threatening the knight since the bishop is breaking the pin, and black would still be in a pretty tough and uncomfortable position here for sure. So in the game, though, they ended up losing material. And their big mistake, I'd say, c6 did allow us to capture the pawn on a7. Might have been a bit safer for them to make a move like king to b8 first. That way they guard the a7 pawn. Then maybe they could try to play c6 after that. But I would say the main mistake is letting us grab the pawn on g7. Now the rook is very, very active, and this led to black's downfall very quickly. We took on f7, we checked on h3, we used some tactics here to win more material. I did miss this bishop to b8 move, which would have won the bishop quicker. But okay, we eventually won the game and got the finish with a nice checkmate here. So that's it for this game. Let's get into the next one. All right, so in our next game here, we're playing against Dars0101, rated 919. So we start off with a knight f3. Our opponent plays the move b6, and essentially here, this is kind of another spot that where we don't really want to autopilot in the opening. We want to really just play for maximum exploitation or taking advantage of our opponent's kind of not fantastic opening play. The main issue for black when they play this move b6 on the first move of the game is that they're not controlling any of the 4 central squares. They're not preventing us from playing a move like e4 or d4. The main moves for black at the start of the game when we play knight f3, usually they're going to play either d5, knight f6, c5. I would say these are kind of 3 of the better options that black can go for, and all 3 of these moves influence at least one or more of the central squares. The problem with a move like b6 is it doesn't really control any of the central squares. Now, when our opponent is doing something like this, we don't want to necessarily just autopilot and play b3 and bishop b2, but we want to exploit their kind of inaccurate opening play. The best way to do this is to put the pawn on the e4 square, and really just to grab as much space in the center of the board as we can. So black develops the bishop, they attack the pawn. I'm going to go knight c3 to protect it. This is one of the main or best moves in the position. Black is going for kind of a double fianchetto here. I'm just going to grab as much space again in the center of the board as I can. I'm going to play the move pawn to d4. And our opponent puts the other bishop on g7. So if you really compare the two sides here, we've got very good control of the center with our 2 pawns. Our knights are also helping to control the other central squares. Black has bishops that are aiming at the center of the board, but no actual pawns in the center of the board. So it's a solid setup for black, but it's a very passive and very, not great setup for black, I would say, ultimately, at the end of the day. Now, that being said, black hasn't done anything super egregious here, and there's no way we're going to be able to just kill black on the spot or just mate them all of a sudden because of their kind of passive opening play. But that being said, we're pretty happy to have the space advantage, and we're going to play around that as the game goes on. So that being said, I think the goal here is just going to be to continue developing our pieces. Black might be going for what's known as the hippo or hippopotamus setup. I wouldn't be surprised if they start doing e6, d6, putting both the knights on e7, a6, and h6. This is what's kind of known as the hippo setup. It's solid but very passive and not, very confrontational, you could say. You're kind of giving white, all the free time in the world to do whatever they want. Okay, with that being said, how are we going to play ourselves here? I think the simplest thing is just to develop the pieces to good squares, castle the king, and then kind of decide later on, you could kind of say. Now, one thing that is generally good to do against this type of setup is to look for these pawn advances on the edges of the board. If we can go h5 to h4 to h5 and poke around, or a4 to a5 and poke around, these can be a little bit annoying for the opponent to deal with, depending on how they, the move orders they go for and stuff like that. Okay, that being said, we're going to start with bishop, getting the development going first. Let's go for, I think we'll go for bishop to c4, just developing the bishop to a good and solid square. They do go for e6. I'm just going to go ahead and let's just castle the king. There are other ways to play against this setup that black's going for. I'm not necessarily going to go all out and try to mate them right away. I'm going to just show that you can play very good and solid moves and get a very pleasant position against this type of setup. So let's go ahead and play rook to e1. Black very well may go for the d6 move. Okay, so they go for d5, which is interesting. I don't necessarily think it's fixing their position by any means, but it's a little bit more confrontational, you could say, compared to the move d6 that I thought they were going to play. Okay, that being said, how are we going to play against this? Of course, our bishop is hit, so we need to do something about that. I think that being the case, I am probably just going to... I'm considering just throwing in a check on b5, which is usually not a great move because a lot of the times the opponent can block the check with the pawn and counterattack the bishop. But the pawn on c6 actually blunts black's bishop a bit. So I'm considering just going for this check here. If they do block with the pawn, I'll retreat my bishop, and then their bishop on b7 will be a bit worse than it normally is. If they don't block with the pawn, they'll have to block with their knight, most likely. Okay, they do decide to block with the pawn. Now I do need to move the bishop again. I think I'm just going to drop it all the way back to the f1 square. It seems a little bit weird to go all the way back to the starting square, but we did already castle, so the bishop is not really in the way of blocking castling or anything like that. And the main point here is that my bishop is kind of out of the way. If I went to the d3 square, it would be blocking the queen, and if I went to the e2 square, it would be blocking the rook. So the nice thing is that even though the bishop is back on the f1 square, it's actually still controlling the same diagonal that it would be controlling if it was on d3 or e2 instead. So they take the pawn on e4. I'm going to recapture with the knight. And simply put, we just have a little bit of a space advantage in the middle of the board with our pawn on d4. And black has this kind of bad, placed bishop on b7. And probably from here, we're just going to prioritize developing our pieces, getting our queen, rook, and bishop into the game, and trying to put a little bit of pressure on black as things go on. Their setup is solid, but once again, it's a bit passive, not having a ton of space. There are definitely some drawbacks to this type of setup that black is going for. Okay, I think I'll go for the move bishop to f4. I like the look of jumping the knight into the d6 square. This would attack the bishop on b7. And the knight on d6 could be very, very annoying for black to deal with. Now, black could move their knight into the center of the board and attack the bishop, but then I think I might just move back to the g3 square and keep it on a safe, solid location. So let's see how black plays here. If they do something like knight to d7, I'm probably going to jump into d6. Okay, they do attack my bishop. My plan was to just drop back to safety. I suppose I could play a move like bishop to d6. This is also a possibility as well. But I think after the rook moves away, I kind of want the... I kind of want that square for the knight, is more so what I'm thinking about here. That being said, actually, let's go for it. I'm going to poke the rook first. I'm going to make the rook move. He's probably going to move the rook to the e8 square is my assumption. And then I'm going to drop the bishop back to safety. And what I will have done by kind of playing bishop d6 first and then retreating is that when the rook is on the e8 square, it actually is a bit more of a target for my knight when it jumps into the d6 square. So once I retreat now knight to d6 not only hits the bishop, but it also is going to hit the rook on the e8 square at the same time. And this could be kind of tricky for black to deal with. So it might kind of look like we gave black a free move. We ended up putting the bishop back on g3 anyways, but we let them play the move rook e8 for free. But my argument here is that the rook on e8 is actually kind of a little bit of a liability, and now black has to be kind of careful about how we're going to be able to jump the knight around and create problems for them. So that being said, they do end up making a move that we can take advantage of here. So they didn't deal with the bishop or the rook. They didn't really do anything to stop us from jumping the knight in. So I am going to make the fork, attacking both pieces. He can play the move rook to e7 to move the rook to safety and save the bishop, which is, I assume that's the move that he's going to play here. But one of the other problems for black here is if we are able to eliminate the bishop on b7, then the knight on a6 will not be protected once that bishop is dealt with or eliminated. So even if he plays the move rook to e7, we can take the bishop, and then once the bishop is gone, then we can take the knight on a6. And so in this case, we're doing a tactic theme that's known as removing the defender. We are eliminating the bishop that was defending this knight on a6. And once black recaptures, now there's nobody protecting this knight. And our bishop that we tucked all the way back on the f1 square just a couple of moves ago, it's able to still jump back to life. It was controlling that exact same diagonal the entire time, even though it was all the way back on the starting square. So this is showing, you know, a good example of the power of bishops. They're really nice on these open diagonals, and so black ends up losing a piece because of this. Okay, they move the rook back to safety. I could play bishop h4 to set up another kind of diagonal lineup. I think I might do that just to poke black and see what they do. Probably they need to block with the knight, bishop, or pawn. But each of these has some drawbacks at the same time. If they block with the bishop, I'm pretty happy to trade pieces. So I'm most likely going to be just taking this bishop on f6. Another possibility is to play the move c4 and do another kind of removing the defender type of tactic. Try to kick the knight away from the d5 square, and then if the knight moves away, then the bishop on f6 won't be protected. If I go pawn to c4, probably black's best move is to take my bishop, but once I take their knight and they move the bishop away, I might actually be able to start kind of jumping around and attacking pawns, and this pawn might actually start becoming a bit of a vacuum cleaner and capturing a bunch of black stuff. So instead of taking back here, I'm going to take the knight on d5, and then I'm attacking both the bishop on h4 as well as the pawn on c6 at the same time, and black can't save both of them simultaneously. The bishop is the more important of the two things, but now I can take the pawn on c6, and this pawn is very close to promoting. I do control the promotion square with my bishop, which is nice. So we're up a piece, we have an extra knight, and we're also now up a pawn at the same time. And so black is in very bad shape at this point. So let's see what they decide to do. Most likely my next moves are going to be like rook to c1. Okay, they go queen to d5 attacking the pawn. I think I'll just go ahead and play the move rook to c1. My idea is to push the c-pawn down the board and try to promote it, simply put. Probably black should play the move rook to c7 to blockade the pawn. It's probably the best scenario for them. Okay, they do block with their rook on c7. Here I'm going to go for the move, probably queen to b3 is what I'm leaning towards. I'm happy to trade queens. I don't really mind so much if they take my queen and double my pawns. It's definitely not the end of the world. I'm still up a knight and a pawn, so if I can get queens off the board, I think it just makes, you know, life pretty simple there. There's lots of other moves that were pretty good to play as well, for sure. Bishop to b7 is another move I might play at the right time later on. So if they don't take me, they probably need to move the queen back to d6 or over to a5 or something like that. And I'm going to try to eventually attack this rook on c7. I want to make this rook move so that I can push my pawn forward. A little bit easier said than done. I don't have a dark square bishop to hit the rook, and my knight's not really going to be able to get to a square like b5 anytime soon. It's going to take a number of moves and jumping around a bunch to get to that square. So probably not happening very soon. Okay, they did take my queen. I'm happy to recapture and get the queens off the board. And yeah, the game plan here probably is to eventually get the knight to b5. I guess to get their... Okay, they're attacking the pawn on a c4, or sorry, on d4. I guess we'll just play a move like, I don't know, let's say rook to c4 to protect this. I might also be able to put the pawn up on the b5 square, and then the pawn on c6 is really well supported. The one thing that's a little bit annoying is that even though my bishop is controlling the c8 square, it's actually not doing much else other than that. So I really want this knight to get to b5. That's really what I want to do. Again, easier said than done. How am I going to do this? Okay, first of all, I'm going to make a move, pawn to g3. This just eliminates any kind of back rank checkmate problems. This eliminates any kind of counterplay that black can have. Let's go ahead and try to start maneuvering the knight, I think. Let's go knight to e5. I don't mind if the knight's captured whatsoever. I'm going to try to figure out a way to get this knight to the b5 square. Probably it needs to get to... Okay, if they want to take the knight, I'm not going to complain about that either. Let's take back with the pawn. I don't really mind giving black the open file. I really just want to, I can now start to fight for the control of that file at the right time. and black is going to have some difficulty dealing with that. So I don't really care if he takes this pawn. If he does take it, he'll allow me to get on the open file. So I'm going to go for the move b4. Probably play b5 pretty soon, just to kind of lock everything in place. Okay, if he gives up the open file, I'll play the move rook to d1 first. And now I'm going to be able to challenge the rook that's blockading the pawn by playing the move rook to d7 at the right time. So let's go b5 first. If I go rook d7, he could trade and then put his rook behind the pawn, which is a little bit annoying. But now I can kind of just slowly but surely work my rook towards the d7 square. The rook really can't move off of e7 all that easily. Yeah, here I'm just going to go rook to d4, rook to d7. I could have also played f4 to guard the pawn if I wanted to. But I want to play rook to d7. Once they take, I'll take with the pawn, and then I'll be able to promote the pawn next move. And black really can't avoid the trade because there's nowhere for the rook to move to. If it goes to c8, I'll take with the bishop at that point. So they're most likely going to take. I will take with the pawn, and then we will promote pretty quickly here. We do have a little under a minute here on the clock, though, so most of the rest of the game, though, is going to be about just converting things. I don't want to take the rook on c7 and lose my rook, so I will take this rook first. And once he takes back, then I'll take the rook on c7, so kind of dealing with his counterplay before I take the rook there. Let's take that. He'll probably try to push the pawn. I'll just put my rook behind it, and then I'll just promote the pawn on c8 pretty quickly here. c7, c8. Let's just get rid of that pawn, not even have to worry about it. We'll now check the king. And let's put the queen here, take away a lot of the escape squares of the king, and the move rook to d8 is the finisher here. We do get the checkmate in this position. Okay, so that was it for this game. In this one, we start off with knight f3 with our kind of ready approach, but when our opponent, again, is not doing anything to influence the center of the board, we are usually going to be playing the move e4 or d4, just taking the space in the center if they're going to give it to us. If they play a more solid move like knight f6, we go b3. If they play d5, we go b3. If they go c5, we go b3. Against, I think even against e6, we can probably stick with a b3 because a lot of the times black is going to play d5 after that anyways. Moves that we're not going to go b3 against are going to be moves that let us put pawns in the center. So against b6, we go e4. Against g6, we go e4. Against d6, we go d4. Oops, sorry, we go d4 because we want to prevent black from playing the move pawn to e5. Against knight c6, we go d4. We saw this in the previous game. What else could black do? Against f5, if they played the Dutch, here we do actually stick with b3 and bishop to b2. And against, again, almost anything else, we're playing, either e4, d4, or b3. If they stop e4, we're probably going for b3. If they hint to e5, we're probably going for d4. And that's kind of the heuristic you could think of when we're trying to decide the second move of the game. In this case, they allow us to play e4. We grab the space in the center. They're playing a solid setup, but it is a little bit passive. We were able to get a space advantage. But I do think it's also, if black plays this position correctly, I don't think black is in, gigantic danger or anything like that. But they did eventually get themselves into trouble here with this knight to a6 move. This is, I'd say, their first kind of true big mistake of the game. Probably what black should have done here, maybe they should have played bishop to f8 to cover the d6 square, and then tried to develop their knight after that pretty quickly. If they had done this, I think I would have played pawn to c4, kicked the knight backwards, maybe made the trade, but black is a little bit worse off because they're behind on space, but it's a relatively solid position at the same time. In the game, black made this mistake of allowing this fork, removing the bishop, losing the piece, and then as things went on, we were able to pick up a little bit more material, and finally we were able to eventually challenge the rook on the c7 square that was blockading our pawn, and once that happened, we won more material, we were able to promote the pawn, and we won the game. So, anyways, though, that's going to be it for this game. Let's go ahead and get into our next one. All right, we got our next game here, playing against Mikhelids, maybe is how you say the name. Rated 926. We're going to go for knight f3 for our Reti Nimzo Larsen approach. So they go for the move d5, so they are making a move that controls part of the center. So we are going to continue with our move pawn to b3. They play pawn to c6. Let's go bishop to b2. And generally speaking, when black goes for the setup of pawn to c6 and pawn on d5, usually they'll play something like knight f6, develop the bishop, e6. They'll kind of set up this almost kind of like a London system type of approach. And it's a very solid setup for black when they go for that. But at the same time, white has ways to play around that. In this particular case, our opponent goes for the move pawn to f6. We have seen the move pawn to f6 in some of the other episodes of the speedrun. And the idea with pawn to f6 is white wants to play the move pawn to black wants to make the move pawn to e5 here. And the usual gist of things in these positions is we don't want to let our opponent play the move pawn to e5 for free. So we are usually going to respond to this f6 type of idea with our move pawn to d4. So we're going to go for that here. We do stop black's idea. Now, there is a drawback to the move d4, of course. The main drawback is that the bishop on b2 is shut in. However, it's, I would say, more of a priority to not let black get two central pawns in the middle of the board for free. For example, if we did something like e3 or g3 trying to develop our light square bishop, black would play e5, then develop their pieces around the center, and we might have a slight lead in development, but black is going to have a very solid center with a nice space advantage, and I'd really rather not let them get two pawns in the center so easily. So we do shut the bishop in a little bit, but we prevent the opponent's idea at the same time. And now we see black going for this really odd-looking knight a6 move. So f6 and knight a6, not exactly the most fear-inspiring or productive moves in the world, I would say. So with that being the case, I'm going to start to look for ways to put a bit of pressure on my opponent when they're making these kind of odd moves in the opening. So usually when you're trying to kind of punish an opponent's opening play, especially if the center of the board is somewhat closed up, usually you're going to want to look for what's known as pawn breaks, advancing pawns to squares where there's a potential trade of pawns that it could occur in the near future, and trying to open up the middle of the board so that our better placed pieces can take advantage of it. So I'm going to go for the move pawn to c4. I think if you played e3 or g3 and continued developing, it also looks very solid for sure. Yeah, we're going to go for pawn to c4. Black plays this move bishop to f5. And here I am thinking I'm just going to go for the move knight to c3. I do see that my opponent's idea is most likely to play knight to b4 and try to fork us on the c2 square. So some people here might think, well, I should just play a3. I stop black from what they're doing. But there's other ways that we can stop this type of fork from happening without playing such a passive reactionary move. So I'm going to go knight c3. I'm assuming black's going to play knight to b4 is my assumption based on their setup here. Okay, they do go knight to b4. They were threatening the fork on c2, but because we've already developed the bishop and the knight off of their starting squares, we have a very easy way of defending against this fork on c2 by playing the move rook to c1. If we go rook to c1, which is what I'm going to go for, if black still makes the check or still puts a piece on the c2 square, we're going to capture it with the rook. They'll recapture with the other piece. We take the second piece with the queen. And generally speaking, it's very favorable in most situations if you can eliminate two of the opponent's minor pieces, in this case a bishop and a knight, and only lose one rook in return. Usually the minor pieces kind of combined together will outperform the rook in the long run. And so with that being the case, I wouldn't mind at all if black was going to play something like knight to c2 check. I would take with the rook happily. Okay, so black plays the move queen a5. So black is putting some threats and pressure in the position. They do have the threat right now of playing a move potentially like knight takes a2, taking advantage of my knight on c3 that would be pinned in that type of position. Now, in order to deal with this, we have a couple of ways to react to it. we could play a move like pawn to a3, moving the pawn off of the square and attacking the knight at this point. Queen to d2 is actually an interesting move that I'm actually leaning towards. I'll kind of explain why in a moment. And I would probably say those are the two main move options that we're considering here. If we let them take on a2, we could try some kind of, let them take on a2, rook to a1, pinning the knight. But there is this trick that black has. They can actually take our knight on c3, attacking our queen on d1, and that would actually not be such a great situation for us. That would not be good for us. So if I go for a3, I think that black can still play this move knight to a2. Oddly enough, they're like moving deep into our territory. They attack the rook on c1, they attack the knight on c3, our knight is pinned. If we move the rook away, they'll take the knight on c3, and I think it gets kind of messy there. Maybe it's still fine, but it's a bit messy. Personally here, I'm liking the look of the move queen to d2 first, just developing a new piece, kind of blocking off the opponent's queen from lining up towards our king. And it looks like it still allows black to take on a2, but once we go rook to a1 and pin the knight in that situation, it's very important that our queen is not on the d1 square, because then if they play that knight takes c3 move, it's not hitting the queen. The queen's on d2 instead of d1 in that case. So I think I'm going to go for this idea. I'm going to go for queen to d2. And then probably a3 after that, now that the knight was no longer pinned. Okay, so he ends up doing knight takes a2 anyways at this point. However, the big change of events is that now that the queen is on the d2 square, when I do play this move rook to a1, which is the move I'm going to go for, if he takes the knight on c3, there's no queen on d1 for him to be attacking. So if he takes the knight, I'm going to take his queen on a5. And as far as I can tell, there's really nothing black can do to avoid losing this knight on a2 at this point. We're going to play rook takes a2. Maybe their best move is to move the queen away and attack our undefended b3 pawn. But even if they do that, I think we're pretty happy to take the knight. They get a pawn. They might have two pawns, but we're up a knight. That's a pretty good situation for us, I would say. So black is... I don't know if I'd call it falling for a trap that we set. I think that a move like queen to d2 is, simply put, just a good move, regardless of whether it included this trap or not. I wasn't really expecting him to take on a2, but if he does take on a2, as he does here in the game, we're happy to see it. Okay, so he took the pawn on c4. I don't need to recapture that pawn yet. I'm going to take the knight on a2 first, attacking the queen. The queen does move to the b4 square. Now I'm going to recapture the pawn on c4. And if black does take this pawn on c4, we actually have another tactic opportunity in this position. So there's a queen on c4. It's eyeing our rook, but our rook is protected, so we're not really concerned about that. But we have a bishop on f1 that's eyeing the queen on c4, but we have a pawn on e2 that's in the way. So here I'm going to move the pawn up to the e4 square, opening up a discovered attack towards the opponent's queen on c4, and I was simultaneously attacking the bishop at the same time. In this case, they saved the bishop, they saw that threat, but they did miss the threat that I had on their queen, and now I'm up a queen and a knight with a gigantic advantage at this point. And the rest of the game is really just going to be about trading pieces, simplifying, and trying to finish things off here. I think it would have been better for black to play the move queen to e6. They would have moved the queen to a safe square and pinned our pawn. I think we still have good ways to work around that, but that was probably a safer move in comparison. Okay, so they play knight h6. I'm just going to castle now. Might as well just do that. It's very difficult for black to develop the kingside pieces, because if they move the e-pawn, we'll be able to capture it regardless of which square it moves to. So if they can't move the e-pawn, then they're not getting the bishop in the game. So we are going to take this pawn. We're very happy to open up the middle of the board. They do attack our queen with rook to d8. I'm going to just move the queen over one square to a slightly safer location. Queen f4 maybe is an even more productive location. Let's go there. Queen f4. Slightly further up the board, slightly more dangerous for our opponent. We're attacking the pawn on f6 a couple of times. If they do take... okay, they don't take. I'm going to take the pawn on f6, though. They're still not able to castle because our bishop on c4 controls the g8 square. And we have a lot of big threats here. We're threatening to take the pawn on g7. We're threatening queen e5 check, forking the king as well as the bishop. If the pawn takes back on f6, then the knight on h6 won't be protected anymore. So black is collapsing here, and they are in a lot of trouble. So they play rook to f8. This does pin the pawn, so if I take the pawn, they will take my queen. But here I can play the move queen e5 check, forking the king as well as the bishop. And, you know, this is very bad news for black at this point. Let's see. It feels like there should be a mate here. Bishop e6 check. He goes back to the e8 square. Rook d1 check. He goes to c8. I think rook d1 check, though. Rook d1, king moves, bishop e6. Black runs out of squares to move the king to. They're going to have to block with another one of their pieces. Lots of ways to win from here. Taking the bishop on c5 would have also been completely winning as well. I'm just trying to grab as much material as I can with as forcing move situations as I can. Every move is coming with a check. So we take the rook with check, and then we'll take the bishop. I could even move this bishop away. I think bishop to something like f5 here. I could even go back to h3. There's nowhere the king can move to. They're going to have to block with the bishop, and then queen to e7 will be checkmate. Of course, I could take the bishop as well, but once the bishop is pinned, queen to e7 is mate because the bishop cannot take the queen due to the pin along the d file at that point. So, yeah, regardless of what black plays here, whether they go to either one of these squares, this is going to be checkmate next move. I could pretty much pre-move it, but he decides to resign instead here. Okay, so let's click through the opening and check it out. So we start off with knight f3, of course. They go for d5. We are going for b3 when our opponent does control part of the center. We're not going for e4 or d4 unless they're kind of allowing us to put multiple pawns in the center of the board a lot of the time. Or at least if they're trying to, you know, play a move like e5. I did discuss some of the heuristics in one of the previous games. So anyways, though, in this case, d5 is a very solid move in the opening, so we go for b3. c6 is also solid. Bishop b2. And then f6 is a little bit odd, I would say. I do understand the idea to play e5. However, we're going to stop that from happening. A much more common way for the opponent to play here is to do something like knight f6. We might go g3, develop, e6, castle, bishop e7. This is kind of like a very close to a London system type of setup. And this is a very solid way to play against a lot of openings when the opponent is not playing with a pawn in the center of the board. That being said, the general gist against this type of setup is we're going to go for moves like c4, d3, knight d2, queen c2, and a lot of the times it's going to revolve around some queenside play. And the d3 pawn is pretty useful because it kind of shuts off the diagonal of the f5 bishop. That's also a pretty common heuristic you'll see throughout the Speedrun series, where if the opponent develops their bishop to f5, a lot of the times we'll be putting our pawn on d3 to kind of close down that bishop's diagonal. So in this particular case, they decide to make the move pawn to f6. They have the idea of playing e5. We do play d4 to shut down that idea, or shut down that pawn advance. We don't let them play that for free. And then the combination of moves with knight a6 and bishop f5, I didn't really think this was all that great of a way of playing. Bishop f5 is maybe fine, but I think if black is going to put the pawn on f6, I think now they should go for maybe bishop f5 still. And then if we go for e3 or g3, they should probably play e6, develop the bishop, develop the knight, castle. It's a lot more of a solid way of playing, rather than this kind of, I would say, overly ambitious, like knight a6, bishop f5, knight b4 type of maneuver here. So as I was saying during the game, a lot of people here might think, oh, I need to stop my opponent from playing knight to b4. I'll play the move a3. Probably nothing really wrong with the move a3 here, but at the same time, it's not really doing anything that's all that productive for our own pieces or our own position. Black might be able to go e6 once again, develop, castle. I like white's position a little bit more because the knight on a6 is a bit oddly placed, but at the same time, black is relatively solid as well. So instead of doing that, though, I was fine with black moving the knight forward. We kind of almost encourage it forward because we have a good way to deal with it. So that was rook to c1. If they do make the check on c2, and we make the sequence of captures. This leads to a very, very nice position for white. The bishop and knight combination tends to outperform the rook in the large majority of situations. So white is very happy to have this kind of position. So he didn't go for that. He played queen a5. I did think about a3 during the game, but I was a little bit concerned about this move knight to a2. Attacking the rook, attacking the knight. If I move the rook away, black takes the knight. I guess I can play queen to d2 to pin the knight here, and I am going to gain it back without being down material. But I figured if I'm going to have to play queen d2 anyways, I might as well just go queen d2, in the first place. I will also point out that there is this idea of playing pawn to b4 to block off the diagonal, hoping to take the knight next move. But here, I think black can take on c3. We recapture, and then, okay, the queen moves away. Black is still better off because of the space advantage, but it's not like white's better off because of the space advantage. It's not like black is going to lose the game anytime soon, though, in this case. So I thought queen d2 was a bit more productive, and it also came with the kind of added bonus of setting a bit of a trap here that our opponent walked right into. He took on a2, got his knight pinned, lost the knight, then he started losing additional material because of other tactics, and once we're up the queen and the knight, it's pretty much game over at this point. Okay, so that was the third game of this episode. Hopefully you've enjoyed the 3 games we took a look at, playing against players in the rating range of 900 to 1,000. In the next episode, we will be taking a look at games against players from 1,000 to 1,100. So hopefully you'll enjoy that next one, and I'll see you in that one.